Imagine waking up one morning to the news that your city, your home, your entire life is surrounded. Not by a small army, but by tens of thousands of enemy troops. Imagine the streets you walk every day slowly turning into a cage, and no one, absolutely no one, coming to save you. This was Paris in 1870. The Franco-Prussian War had been boiling quietly in the background. The whispers of politics, of ambition, of national pride, slowly transforming into thunderous mobilization. France, proud, confident, still smarting from the defeat of Napoleon III in previous campaigns, believed itself ready. Prussia, under the calculating eye of Otto von Bismarck, believed it could reshape Europe in a single decisive strike. In July 1870, war broke out. France had declared it, spurred by a mix of pride, fear, and miscalculation. Prussia answered swiftly, with precision and method. And within weeks, the city of Paris found itself at the center of a siege that would change the nation forever. The first weeks of the siege were almost surreal. Parisians, accustomed to elegance, cafes, theaters, and bustling markets, were suddenly faced with the realization that the city was cut off. The Prussian army had encircled Paris with an iron ring. Every bridge, every road, every rail exit was under surveillance, guarded or outright blocked. No messages could get through, no reinforcements would arrive. Supplies dwindled with alarming speed. At first, the people tried to maintain normalcy. Cafes stayed open, shops tried to sell what little remained. But the reality of starvation crept in silently, almost invisibly at first. Prices soared. Flour disappeared, meat vanished, and when people realized that food could not be imported, that even the outskirts of the city offered no refuge, panic began to set in. It wasn't just hunger, it was humiliation, it was fear, it was the slow, grinding weight of inevitability. Parisians had long believed their walls, and their culture made them invincible. They were Paris, center of Europe, beacon of civilization, and yet here they were, trapped, watched, surrounded. The military situation was grim. Napoleon III had personally taken command of the French forces, a decision that would haunt him. The French army, though large, was poorly coordinated, inadequately supplied, and decisively outmaneuvered. The Battle of Sedan had already crushed morale, and the emperor himself was captured, leaving Paris without leadership at the highest level. The city became a fortress without a general, and then came the cannons. The Prussians didn't storm the walls immediately. They bombarded, they pressured, they applied psychological warfare. Artillery shells fell on the outskirts, on the outer arrondissement, creating terror, confusion, and casualties. Parisians huddled in basements, in cellars, in darkened apartments, listening to the distant rumble of what would become their world shrinking around them. Yet amidst the fear, there was also a strange resilience. The citizens of Paris began to organize, volunteers formed, National Guards patrolled the streets, makeshift hospitals opened, and in a remarkable display of ingenuity, the Parisians even created ways to communicate with the outside world. Hot air balloons carried letters and messages over Prussian lines. Telegraphs tried to function. But these were small victories in the face of a siege designed to break the city slowly, relentlessly, and completely. By September, the hunger was unmistakable. Bread became a symbol of survival and despair. The wealthy could still buy what remained of flour, but the poor had little choice. Horses were slaughtered for food. Dogs, cats, and any other animals available were consumed. It sounds unimaginable now, but this was the reality in the heart of Europe's most cultured city. And still, the Prussians held. Bismarck's strategy was methodical. He wanted Paris to surrender, not because he sought to destroy it outright, but because a submission would signal the triumph of Prussia over France without the mess of urban slaughter. And yet, the psychological pressure was relentless. Every day, the city's clock ticked closer to desperation. Inside the city, rumors spread faster than news could be verified. Some said reinforcements were coming, others whispered of traitors and spies. Morale ebbed and flowed like a tide, with moments of hope cruelly replaced by reality. Children went hungry, families argued, fought, cried, and in the salons and government offices, the leaders debated, argued, and planned, often ineffectively, how to break the siege, how to survive, and how to maintain the fragile structure of society within the walls. But here's the thing that makes this siege unforgettable. Paris didn't just survive, Paris resisted. Amid starvation, chaos, and bombardment, the city held its character, its stubbornness, its identity. The people wrote, they painted, they theorized, they debated. The intellectual heart of France did not extinguish under siege. It throbbed defiantly. And while the city struggled, the political landscape of Europe shifted dramatically. Across the Rhine, the unification of Germany under Prussia gained momentum. Victories at Sedan, the fall of Napoleon III, and the siege of Paris itself were pieces of a larger puzzle, the collapse of the old European order and the rise of a new one forged in blood and calculated diplomacy. The winter of 1870-1871 was cruel. Temperatures dropped, food became more scarce, disease spread. Cholera, typhus, and other illnesses took their toll on those already weakened by hunger. Yet the Parisians adapted. Gardens in courtyards were cultivated, canals were fished, and whatever could be scavenged was pressed into service. Every day was a battle against both the enemy outside and the deprivation inside. And still, the human spirit showed flashes of resilience and creativity. Newspapers, which had been heavily censored, found ways to circulate messages, commentary, and encouragement. Satirical sketches mocked the enemy. Songs were written about the plight of the city. Even as the siege tightened, Parisians retained a sense of identity, of humor, of life itself. By January 1871, the city had endured months of siege. Starvation was rampant, morale teetered on the edge. The government, increasingly desperate, negotiated in secrecy, weighing surrender against further suffering. Each day, the Prussians tightened their grip, and each day, the people of Paris faced the stark reality. Survival demanded compromise, and compromise demanded pride be set aside. And then, finally, the decision came. The French government agreed to an armistice. Paris had held, had resisted, had survived far longer than most expected, but at a terrible cost. Tens of thousands had died from starvation and disease. The city's population had been hollowed, its spirit tested in ways history rarely records, and the psychological imprint of this siege would linger for decades, shaping French culture, politics, and memory. The Siege of Paris was more than a military campaign. It was a test of human endurance, a battle of wills, a crucible of civilization. It showed what happens when a city's pride meets the relentless calculation of a well-led adversary, and it revealed, perhaps most profoundly, that even in the most modern and cultured of cities, hunger, fear, and despair can strip life down to its rawest elements. But the story didn't end with surrender alone. The Prussians marched through the outskirts, their presence looming like an unshakable shadow. Streets once filled with laughter, and life now echoed with the clatter of boots and the murmur of exhausted citizens. Paris had survived, yes, but at what cost? Every corner, every boulevard whispered loss. Families had been torn apart by starvation. Children who had never known hunger now stared hollow-eyed at empty plates. The city's cultural heartbeat, though still alive, had slowed under the relentless weight of siege. Inside the city, negotiations dragged on like a winter night that refused to end. The French officials, humiliated yet defiant, fought to preserve dignity in a surrender that felt like betrayal. And the Parisians? They watched, powerless, as the fate of their homes was decided in grand rooms far removed from the desperation on the streets below. Pride clashed with survival. patriotism wrestled with the primal need to eat. And in that tension, the city teetered on the edge of despair. The Prussians, ever strategic, allowed certain freedoms, but only enough to remind Parisians of their vulnerability. Markets reopened, but prices remained artificially high. Movement was controlled. Rumors of further occupation kept hearts racing and nerves frayed. Every day was a reminder that the city's autonomy had been compromised. Every day was a silent echo of the months of suffering they had endured. Yet Paris refused to vanish into silence. Newspapers, clandestine bulletins, and word of mouth became lifelines. Citizens chronicled the siege not as passive victims, but as active witnesses to history. They wrote about hunger, yes, but also about courage, ingenuity, and resilience. They debated politics, philosophy, and the nature of freedom, proving that even encircled and starving, the mind could remain defiant. The city's defenses, once impressive, now lay in ruins. Barricades had been dismantled, fortifications shelled and worn down by relentless bombardment. Soldiers, both young and old, weary yet undiminished in spirit, returned to civilian life as best they could, carrying with them memories that would haunt them for years. Parisians, hardened by months of deprivation, emerged from cellars and shelters like survivors of a prolonged storm, forever changed by what they had endured. The psychological scars were immense. The siege had been more than physical deprivation. It had been a slow, grinding test of the human psyche. People had stared into the abyss of despair and survived. They had been forced to confront mortality, helplessness, and the fragility of society. And through it all, they had retained, in some stubborn, indefinable way, their identity as Parisians. Outside the city, the consequences of the siege rippled across Europe. Prussia's success solidified its influence, reshaped alliances, and laid the groundwork for the unification of Germany. France, meanwhile, faced not only the loss of territory and prestige, but a profound cultural reckoning. How could a nation that prided itself on military prowess, culture, and political sophistication be humbled so thoroughly? Questions of leadership, strategy, and national character would haunt French politics for decades. Within Paris itself, the rebuilding began almost immediately. Streets were cleared, bridges repaired, and the first hesitant markets reopened. But the memories lingered, and the population, though physically surviving, carried an invisible weight. Families counted their dead, households accounted for missing loved ones, and the city grappled with the enormity of what had occurred. The siege was not simply an event. It had become a defining chapter in Parisian life, a scar etched into the psyche of the city. And yet, even in this grim aftermath, sparks of hope emerged. Artists painted what they had seen, writers chronicled the siege with unflinching honesty, citizens shared stories of heroism, ingenuity, and solidarity. Paris, battered and starved, refused to be erased. The siege had tested everything, and while it had revealed the depths of suffering, it had also illuminated the heights of resilience. By the spring of 1871, the armistice had been formalized. The Prussian forces withdrew, and Paris began the slow process of recovery. But the lessons of the siege were not easily forgotten. The city had been laid bare, its vulnerabilities exposed, and its people forced to confront the raw realities of war, hunger, and powerlessness. And in that exposure, the very identity of Paris had been transformed. The memory of the siege lingered in the streets, in the stories passed down, and in the collective consciousness of France. Generations would remember how a city of art, intellect, and pride had been brought to the edge of survival. They would remember the ingenuity that kept hot air balloons floating over enemy lines, the bravery of volunteers who risked life and limb to maintain order, and the relentless spirit of a population that refused to succumb entirely, even as starvation stalked every neighborhood. And perhaps most chillingly, they would remember how quickly civilization could be stripped away, how fragile comfort and security truly are, and how the will of a calculated enemy could grind even the proudest city into submission. The Siege of Paris is not remembered merely as a military engagement. It is remembered as a human crucible. It revealed what people are capable of when cornered, what society can endure when pushed to its limits, and what courage looks like in the face of overwhelming adversity. It is a testament to both the fragility and the strength of the human spirit. As the city emerged from its ordeal, it carried scars, visible and invisible. Streets and buildings bore the marks of bombardment. Bodies that had succumbed to hunger and disease were buried in hastily prepared graves. And yet, the living carried with them a sense of survival that transcended pain, a reminder that even when all seems lost, resilience persists. The story of the Siege of Paris leaves us with a haunting truth. Empires can fall, armies can advance, and cities can be encircled. But the human spirit, even when battered and starved, refuses to vanish quietly. The siege was a test of endurance, a challenge of identity, and a crucible of willpower. And when it finally ended, the city and its people were forever changed, hardened, wiser, and forever marked by the shadow of those dark months. Paris would rebuild, France would reflect, Europe would shift, but the memory of that long, desperate winter where hunger gnawed, fear stalked, and the Prussian army waited patiently just beyond the walls would echo for generations. And in that echo, there is a lesson that resonates even today. No matter how sophisticated, cultured, or proud a society may be, when pushed to its limits, survival becomes the ultimate test of character. So when you think of Paris, don't only picture the lights, the art, and the grandeur. Remember also the shadows. Remember the hunger, the desperation, the fear, and the courage. The Siege of Paris was more than history. It was a mirror to humanity itself, reflecting both our fragility and our indomitable will. And in that reflection, the story leaves its final, unforgettable mark. The knowledge that even in the darkest hours, a city and the people who define it can endure, and in enduring achieve a kind of quiet, haunting triumph.